Having surpassed 1,000 completed anime, it's time to review my old favorites and find out what holds up. I'm Sacrabolic, your envoy of hope, and this is Anime Favorite Search. Monogatari series' second season consists mostly of what was known as the second season, which is sort of like the sagas in the Monogatari series. It leaves out the Hana Monogatari, which actually got its own anime adaptation, but I believe it adapts every other part of the second season of the light novels. It's actually interesting, because it's basically the midpoint of the story, and yet it acts as a sort of climax for a lot of the characters. The show builds up a lot of important details, there's a lot of foreshadowing, and there's a lot of things that set up that will all have payoffs in the final season as we move into Owari Monogatari. But it is also worth noting that the specific tales in second season also act as sort of finalities for the characters. There isn't necessarily you could stop at second season, and I actually think Monogatari would be a satisfying enough story. I obviously would encourage going on to final season and Owari, because I think Owari Season 2 is fucking amazing. It's probably the best of the whole series. But you could stop at Season 2 and get the emotional climaxes of many of the stories and many of the characters, a lot of whom are only pseudo-relevant as we go into the final arcs of the story. And I think you could be perfectly satisfied. But regardless of that, let's start off with Tsubasa Tiger is an arc where we get to see the re-emergence of Black Hanakawa, and also a new entity created by Hanakawa called Kako, which is a sort of tiger manifestation that burns down people's houses wherever Hanakawa sleeps that night, and is apparently a manifestation of her envy over her stress instead. This arc overlaps with the Shinobu Time and Shinobu Male arc, and is surprisingly quick-paced. If anything, the fact that we get to see both of those, I think, longer arcs actually occur in the span of just this one, I believe one of which even mostly occurs in the span of a single day, really goes to show you how much shit Araragi has to go through. Regardless, this arc is primarily focused on Hanakawa, and to a decent extent, her relationship with Senjo Gahara, where this is the arc where we really get to see them become friends. There's sort of an implication that they were already friends before, but this really solidifies their relationship when Hanakawa's house burns down and she ends up staying the night with Senjo Gahara, and then later ends up staying the night with Tsukihi and Karin over at the Araragi house. We also get to see a sort of interesting interaction between Izuko and Hanakawa, where notably, Izuko, in every scene she's in where she has an opportunity to talk about Hanakawa, shit talks Hanakawa. I don't know why there's beef there, but there's clearly some sort of beef there. Though notably, she gives Hanakawa the point in the right direction in this arc, and also specifically mentions that Kako, the tiger entity being manifested by Hanakawa, is a oddity with strength unparalleled in history, is how she described it. And coming from Izuko Gaien, this is a big fucking claim that you almost have to take seriously, and it is notable that towards the end of the arc, Araragi basically fucking one-shots this. Now, I know that Monogatari doesn't necessarily lend itself towards comparing characters' fighting abilities, but the amount of buildup this tiger has to get one-shot by Araragi actually does speak to just how dangerous Araragi is when he's wielding the Kokoro Watari and is actually trying to take down an entity. It's like, shout out to my boy, I guess is what I'm saying. Anyway, this arc is super important. This arc, Senjo Gahara has short hair, and I don't recall if she had it in the last time we saw her. So this might be the arc where she cuts her hair short. I will also say that at this point, I believe pretty much every girl in the series has officially swapped their hair length. Because I know Karin's hair appears to be cut, and I know Tsukihi's hair has grown out now, and we already had Hanakawa's hair cut, which this is this arc where she gets her tiger stripes. We'll talk about that later. So at this point, pretty much every primary female character has swapped their hairstyle, except for the ones who pretty much can't, like Mayoi and Shinobu, and Nadeko. Nadeko has not swapped her hairstyle yet. I guess technically neither has, like, Ogi or whatever, but the important thing I want to talk about Izuku Gaien is this is also the arc where Hanekawa encounters Gaien's signature catchphrase of, "I know everything, there is nothing I do not know," which is a great contrast to Hanekawa's catchphrase of, "I don't know everything, I only know what I know." And also notably an interesting contrast to Ogi Oshino's, "I don't know anything, it's what you know," which are, I think, together brings forth the link between what would arguably be considered the three most intelligent and dominating females as far as the plot of the series goes. It's worth mentioning, but not really the focus of the arc. Where this arc really focuses on is Hanekawa coming into her own, where the arc is dedicated a good portion to Hanekawa being pure white or plain or boring, because throughout her associations with the oddities, she severs more and more of herself so she can present herself as this perfect good girl, while Black Hanekawa or Kako the tiger are fucking shit up through her repressed emotions. And this is the arc where Hanekawa learns to accept those repressed emotions, take them into her, and become one would argue, a more complete person, and metaphorically earn her stripes. Mayoi Jingshi shows us our first sighting of best girl Ogi Oshino right at the start with a monologue about a bit of a trivia fact where all of the stoplights on a traffic signal will actually turn red for about 3 seconds before a light turns green, specifically to prevent a bunch of cars from crashing into each other. This is actually one of those monologues that has stuck with me throughout Monogatari, and it clearly relates to the car accident that occurred to Mayoi Hachikuji, and this is an arc really dedicated to her and Shinobu, but I also feel like this same monologue has some application to Shinobu's arc. I don't have a solid theory about what that is yet, so don't ask me. I feel like there's something there. Knowing Nisio Eising, there's something there. I'm just not sure, and I've got to watch the next arc. I've got to keep going. These videos got to come out. So I don't have time to create a fully solidified theory. Regardless, she is not officially introduced in this arc, which is important because the whole thing about Monogatari series second season is that they keep showing her with no introduction. And so this monologue is actually a bit of a flash forward, and she won't be fully introduced until Owari. Regardless, the crux of the arc is Araragi has 2 hours to finish his summer homework because he spent all of summer studying, but he spent none of summer actually doing his damn homework. So he's like, man, if only we could go back in time to yesterday. And Shinobu's like, oh yeah, I can bring you back in time yesterday. And he's like, then let's go back in time yesterday. And then they accidentally go 11 years back in time. And so Araragi decides that he is going to save Hachikuji from getting hit by that car, which of course is what relates to Ogi's opening monologue at the start of the arc. And then after doing that, they go back to the future. Butterfly effect. It's a bit of a cliche. The whole world is destroyed and zombies are filling the streets. Oh, nosers. This arc really doesn't, I suppose, in the grand scheme of the story, doesn't really change too much, but it really does show the ever-increasing and developing relationship between Araragi and Shinobu. Even though this is titled to be a Mayoi arc, it is almost just as much, if not more so, a Shinobu arc, as we see the relationship fully solidify from what was beginning to get set up in Nisei. The I will die on the same day that you die sort of mentality they end up having, this developed philosophy that these two end up with. And it is as well a Mayoi arc, but we don't really get too much Mayoi development in this arc. We do get to see a bit of the idea of a grown-up Mayoi, which is kind of cool. And we get to see a brief, tiny team-up between the juniors in the occult research club of Oshino, Kaganui, and Kayaki. But with Mayoi, what this really does show is just how important she is to the narrative, even if this Mayoi arc is actually, if anything, a little bit Mayoi light. Nadeko Medusa is an arc where, at the start of it, Nadeko ends up encountering Ogi Oshino for the first time, who immediately knows who she was, claiming she's heard about her from Araragi and her uncle, and then goes on to refer to Nadeko as a side quest she's fucked up on that's not that important before driving off on a bicycle, after which Nadeko begins to see white snakes everywhere, which eventually leads her to talking to Araragi about seeing white snakes, and then setting up a meeting with him and Shinobu to solve the white snake issue, then blowing off the meeting to go to the Shirohebe shrine where she was cursed at before, where she encounters a gigantic white snake god that gets her to agree to completely blow off the Araragi meeting, not even investigate it, lie to him, tell him that the problem has gone away, so that she can run around at night with this giant snake so that she can find the snake's corpse, because the corpse is sort of hanging on by a thread and is barely being animated by the negative energy produced by Shinobu and the apparition killer. The first half of the arc is a whole lot of setup. We do get the snake disguising itself as like a hair tie scrunchie around Nadeko's wrist, and I think that's absolutely adorable. I also think it's interesting that Ogi considers Nadeko an unimportant side quest that she's fucked up on, when, if anything, Nadeko is the piece on the game board that costs Ogi the entire game, because she and turns out to be, or at least the Shirohebe Shrine, turns out to be such a important and foundational part of Izuko's game board. Regardless, I will say that we also start to get the initial hints that there might be some darker aspects to Nadeko's character. The prevalent thing that we see throughout the early parts of the characterization in this arc is that Nadeko often has burdens placed on her by her classmates and her teachers and other people's expectations of her, but she deflects them. She doesn't face anything head on. She's very non-confrontational. And whenever a conflict happens, instead of trying to work things out, she always says something like, well, let's put that to the side for now. She ignores the instruction she was given by her teacher to fix the class, which, again, is not a job that she should have, but it's also something that she could have turned down. And this does go to lean into this sort of personality of Nadeko, of how she has a very deflective personality, and she really just wants to skate by being completely unnoticed. In fact, she even mentions that at one point when talking to the snake, that she doesn't want people paying attention to her or noticing that she's talking to a wrist tie on her wrist. And this also begins to line up with the confrontation that she has with Shinobu, where Shinobu points out that she does a lot of playing the victim. There's something that's mirrored and paralleled with something that the snake says to her. The snake claims that there are no victims and that everyone is a wrongdoer, which is opposed by what Ogi tells her, where no one is a wrongdoer and everyone is a victim. These don't contradict each other nearly as much as you'd expect if you actually think about them, and it all goes aligning with this sort of facet of Nadeko's personality that we're beginning to get hints into during this arc, this sort of new layer we're starting to see, where Nadeko tries to stay under the radar, and she tries to hide her cuteness through like her bangs and stuff, but she does manage to get away with this non-confrontational situation and manages to get people to rely on her due to being essentially attractive. And where the closest parallel I can get to Nadeko's behavior is that she's kind of like what they say about Jerry in Rick and Morty, where Nadeko is a predator that pretends to be prey. The second half of the Nadeko Medusa arc sort of gets into where the title of the arc comes from. In this second half, we get to see Nadeko successfully locate the corpse of the snake that she's been talking to, and we learn that the snake apparition is actually pretty much largely in her head. I'm not actually sure if it is truly in her head. The dialogue she has with it says that it is, but they also say that the snake apparition may have been created from her own worship. So I think it sort of rides the line. I think it's almost a little ambiguous. If we were to just take the last bit of information we receive about it, it appears as if the snake apparition was a fabrication created by Nadeko that she herself was repressing in her own memories. But if we look at the context throughout the greater narrative, it could go either way. It is possible that it was an apparition that was just so weak and was tied to so little negative energy that only Nadeko was capable of manifesting it. And it is also worth noting that this is all being filtered through a flashback where it is revealed that the hair tie was originally given to her by Ogi Oshino, and the idea of consuming the snake's corpse was also given to her by Ogi Oshino. So there's this sort of underlying idea that it's like, well, how much of this was a fabrication, how much of this was a reality, and how much of this was planned by Ogi? And the answer was almost certainly most of this was planned by Ogi, because that's how Ogi rolls. Regardless, this gets us to the build-up that starts at the beginning of the arc. The arc opens in the first half with this image where Araragi is here to kill Nadeko, and Nadeko has like fucking snake hair and shit. And so this gets us to that point where Nadeko willfully, she has this fucking crash out in the middle of the school where she yells at her teacher and all of her classmates. It's a great fucking scene. And then she's confronted by Araragi and Shinobu. Shinobu mouths off, makes the situation so much worse. And then Nadeko eats the fucking snake body and becomes a snake god, and then goes full fucking yandere, starts fucking stabbing the shit out of Araragi, stabs the shit out of Shinobu, just goes full murderer and is like, well, I'm gonna kill everyone now. And is barely held off by Senjo Gahara, who's like, hold up, before you kill them, may I offer some advice? You definitely want to kill Shinobu before Araragi, or she's gonna fucking wreck your shit. And Nadeko's like, perfect advice, love that, thanks for saying it. And then Senjo Gahara's like, also, you're gonna want to kill me before Shinobu, or I'm gonna wreck your shit. And Nadeko's like, that doesn't seem possible. And Senjo Gahara's like, I'ma do it. And then she's like, alright, fine. And so Senjo Gahara manages to negotiate for about 6 months worth of time before Nadeko, in her Medusa form, fucking murders everyone, specifically so that they can graduate beforehand. And that sort of leaves this on a semi-bit of a cliffhanger, although there is an end credit scene where Nadeko is confronted with Araragi, a teenage Shinobu who she shouldn't know about. So this is a really interesting scene because I don't believe this is an event that actually occurs. I think this is another delusion caused by Nadeko. But anyway, and we also see her greeted by Senjo Gahara, we see her greeted by Kanbaru, and we see her greeted by Hanakawa. And again, I don't believe this event occurs. I think this is all in her head. So this flash forward where we see all of these characters and these interpretations, and we see teenage Shinobu, this could very easily just be a sort of artistic license being taken on Studio Shaft's behalf. Regardless, we get to see Nadeko, who we know hides behind her bangs throughout the course of the show, to sort of hide her true feelings, and we sort of engage with her holding on to her romantic feelings for Araragi out of convenience, so that she has in sort of an excuse to not progress as a person. And her bangs are cut by Tsukihi in this arc, which leaves her forehead exposed, so she has sort of no way to hide. It is worth noting that in her Medusa form, her forehead is also exposed, and in the flash forward scene where she fights everyone, she puts her hair back in a ponytail, her hair being snakes in this instance, back in a ponytail showing that she has nothing more to hide. And so we also get a sort of, this sort of calls back to the Kwaomi Mountain arc, where we talk about snakes molting and shedding their skin and being symbols of immortality. And in this arc, one could make the argument that Nadeko is shedding her previous juvenile skin and is sort of coming into her own. But one would make the argument, I would make the argument, that the Medusa arc isn't necessarily a fully formed adult Nadeko, in that she's not there yet, and this is sort of her molting stage. It is also worth noting that outside of the flash forward, this arc sort of ends on a cliffhanger, which tees up the whole thing for the upcoming Hitagi end arc. Shinobu Time follows Mayoi and Araragi trying to get the backpack from his house that he'd attempted to deliver to her during the Mayoi Jingshi arc. And while that's happening, they suddenly get attacked by a sort of phenomenon called the Darkness. They call it that. It doesn't really have an entire name, but it is an entity that appears to follow mostly on the ground, that follows after people, specifically apparitions, or oddities, as you would call them. And so Mayoi and Araragi end up fleeing, and they end up getting assistance, albeit briefly, from Yotsugi Ononoki. During this, we also find out a bit about Shinobu's backstory, because she once had an interaction with this same entity, the same phenomenon, back when she created her original minion, as mentioned in Kizu Monogatari. And so, this arc is named after Shinobu, but interestingly, like the Mayoi Jingshi arc, which is really more of a Shinobu arc, I would actually say that the Shinobu Time arc is, if anything, more of a Mayoi arc, because this really brings together a whole bunch of foreshadowing that we had seen from previous Mayoi arcs, like offhanded references that Araragi would never see Mayoi again, or references to things or nothingness or darkness following after Mayoi, and of course, the iconic Courage to Tell a Lie scene, which is basically the through line and entire point of this entire plotline. I will say that with this, we also have the introduction of one of my favorite characters in Izuku Gaien, who, with Izuku and with the Darkness, we can firmly say that the central antagonist of the Monogatari series has been officially introduced. Now, whether that is Izuku, or whether that's the Darkness, or whether that's Ogi, I'm not fully sure. I don't necessarily know who I'm calling the central antagonist, but it's one of those three, and therefore we can say that they've been officially introduced now. I absolutely love Izuku, and she is one of the least developed characters because she's almost sort of like a plot device, as the woman who knows everything. But there's something about like this character that's like borderline omniscient, and has got this like cool hip-hop style that's also coincidentally connected to basically all of the central characters in the story. There's just something cool about her. It's a lot of vibes based, because we don't have a lot going on with the oddity specialists. But regardless, I will say that this arc did actually bring a bit of a tear to my eye with how well the execution is on the finale. And with this, we're starting to finally get all of the payoff. Not all of the payoff. We're starting to get some of the payoff that has been built out throughout the entire course of the previous series through what was known as Monogatari first season, and we're starting to see where some of that foreshadowing was leading. Obviously, we're not in the finale yet, so we're not getting all of the beats, but as far as a sort of mid-series episode, the Shinobu Time arc manages to be both important and heartbreaking. Hitagi End is honestly more of a Kaeki Deshu or a Nadeko arc than it is a Hitagi arc, but it is an important step for her character because she reaches out to Kaeki in order to have him basically try and get Nadeko off of their shit, because Nadeko is still planning to kill Senjogahara, Araragi, and Shinobu. And we get a moment where, starting with a very humorous start to the arc, we get a moment where Kaeki is debating to himself whether he wants to take this case or not, even though it doesn't greatly benefit him. And the fact that we actually see a shot of him looking in the mirror as he tries to think about a reason to take this case, he does end up finding one, obviously, because that's sort of the crux of the arc. But it almost makes me wonder if Kayaki didn't necessarily want to take, like, he did want to take the case the entire time, and he was just looking for an excuse that sort of fits in with his persona. He ends up saying that he is willing to do it because Senjo Gahara is a friend of Kanbaru. And there is an implication in this arc that Kayaki has a sort of relationship, or at least like a crush on Kanbaru's mom. One example for that being that at one point there is a very brief shot. It's hard to describe how Monogatari sometimes conveys information, where you just see like text flash up on the screen for a very brief amount of time for like a small number of frames, one of which mentions that he was in love with a woman who died in a car accident. And we know that Kanbaru's mom, and I believe her dad also, died in a car accident. I know her mom died in an accident. I don't necessarily know if it's a car accident, but this creates a sort of implication that Kayaki Deshu had a thing for Kanbaru's mom, and he is willing to use that as an excuse. He doesn't necessarily vocalize this, and this is mostly me reading into the context of the show, but it is also worth noting that part of the philosophical discussion that occurs during this arc is Kayaki tells Nadeko during his confrontation with her that a wish is only a true wish if you don't vocalize it, because words are inherently all lies, and to say them out loud is to sort of devalue your wish. And so it is also possible that Kayaki not vocalizing his love for Kanbaru's mom could also be a reflection of his love for Kanbaru's mom. It is also worth noting that Kayaki specifically states that he has lied a little bit in his presentation of this arc. Whether that's true or not, it's hard to tell with Kayaki, but it is certainly... It's you sort of have to take things at face value with Monogatari, even if you know that there's some sort of narrative unreliability going through the perspectives of the characters, especially with Araragi and Kayaki Deshu, because of their similarities and their propensity to exaggerate and lie. Regardless, we do get a bit more of the perspective on Nadeko and why she has gone so completely off the deep end, because this arc basically functions as a character study of Nadeko, where Kayaki basically gets into what makes her tick, how Nadeko refuses to allow her heart to basically open up to anyone, and how she has a vast distrust of everyone around her, and how her sort of love for Araragi is more one of convenience than any actual emotions. Kayaki becomes very convinced that he can deceive Nadeko into believing that the trio are deceased. And this is, I will have to say, one aspect of this arc that I've never fully understand. They say that Nadeko isn't used to experiencing malice, but they also say that she never trusts anyone. So Kayaki is very convinced that she's easy to lie to. And indeed, she probably is easy to lie to. But I think that's also getting filtered through the fact that Nadeko has an inherent distrust for everyone she meets. So I'm not quite certain why he was so confident that he was going to get to be able to lie to her. And it didn't end up working. And obviously they had to have a heart-to-heart about like dreams and ambitions and stuff like that. And I think it did work out pretty well. There is, I will say that the best part of this arc is the ending conversation where Kayaki is talking Nadeko down. And it is, honestly, I didn't remember it being that good of a conversation, but honestly, it's probably one of the best parts of the Monogatari series as a whole. One other thing I would like to talk about as regards to this arc is the sort of background influences of two very specific characters. You know who they are. They're Izuko and best girl Oshino Ogi. First off, I believe this arc confirms that Ogi is not Oshino Meimei's niece. I forget whether he's talking to Senjo Gahara or whether he's talking to Hanakawa. I believe it is Hanakawa. Also, There's some pretty solid lines in this arc. I remember Kayaki had one that hit really hard, but unfortunately, I didn't get to record this review fast enough for me to remember what it was. But I do remember Hanekawa's line where he asks her to swear to God, and she says she swears to a cat, and he's like, I don't know what that means. But that line goes fucking hard, because she says it with full seriousness. It's also worth noting that this is post-Sodachi Lost arc, so Hanekawa is just rocking the tiger stripes the whole time. And honestly, I'll say this, I'm not a big fan of post-Lost Hanekawa, but when she's just like going full tiger mode, a tiger Hanekawa is fucking awesome. So anyway, regardless of that, we know that Izuku Gaien wanted Kayaki to pull out of that. She offers him $3 million to pull out, but she gives him the money before he successfully pulls out and then retracts her support from Kayaki. And of course, his association with her and his interactions with Nadeko in her full Medusa god form and all of that basically confirms what I was saying in the earlier arcs, where there is absolutely no way that Kayaki Deshu does not know about the supernatural. So we can basically disregard all of that bullshit. He really is a real fake oddity specialist. But anyway, we also know that Senjo Gahara also attempted to dissuade him from taking her case, specifically because they both see him as a bit of a contrarian and knew that would just urge him to go harder. And so at the end of the series, we actually have Kayaki questioning to himself, how much of this did Izuku actually foresee? And this is a solid question that we get, because there are occasional instances where we see where it looks like Izuku's foresight is not 100% clear. She claims to know everything, but whether she does or not is hard to tell. She definitely is the leader of the game, and she is performing very well against Ogi, but it is also worth noting that she doesn't necessarily need to be as omniscient as she claims to beat Ogi in the game. She just needs to be smarter than Ogi, and that's not something that is outside of her wheelhouse with all of her experience and all of her resources. But regardless of that, we don't quite know how much of this was planned, but we do know that this game went exactly how she wanted it to. We also have to say that I think the Hatagi end arc is probably Ogi's greatest misplay against Izuku, but regardless of that, we do see Ogi's shadow going throughout the entire course of this, as Kayaki muses about what could have possibly caused Nadeko to swallow the snake in the first place, and obviously there is the, let's call it, killer ending of this arc, where Ogi sort of takes one of Izuku's pieces off the board for the remainder of the game. Regardless, the Hitagi end arc is a very interesting end to Season 2, and could act as a definitive conclusion to the series if you didn't know that more was incoming. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your envoy of hope. Bye-bye!